Buckle up, because we're diving deep today into a life, a story you won't soon forget.
Yeah, we're going way beyond those headlines you see to get to the heart of Adam Yusuf's experience.
Exactly as he tells it himself in his book, The True Me, How I Became a National Risk in Sweden.
That's right. But we'll also be weaving in insights from a short piece he wrote titled Start from When the Uprising Syria Started, part.
And he's also shared some pretty powerful visuals to add context to.
So the goal here is really to give you a direct line to understanding Adam's journey.
I mean, this is a guy who went from childhood in Syria through radicalization and then get this de-radicalization.
All culminating in him seeking asylum in Sweden.
So we're talking about massive personal change, the impact of conflict on a human level, and how identity can really shift over time.
It's heavy stuff, but Adam's story offers us a real window into these complex issues.
Right, so let's rewind all the way back to the start, to Syria before the uprising.
Okay.
Adam's early years, they were obviously overshadowed by, just immense hardship later on. But the way he writes about them, there's this real warmth, this sense of connection, especially with his mom.
Yeah, the love comes through so strongly.
Absolutely. It's almost idyllic in those early memories.
It makes you think about how vital those early bonds are, you know?
Yeah.
Like that sense of security and love. It's such a contrast to the trauma he faces later.
100%. And it makes you appreciate how those foundational relationships can shape someone's resilience, right?
Definitely.
You get this great glimpse into just like normal childhood too. Like he
Yeah.
talks about sneaking to play Atari when he wasn't supposed to.
Oh, yeah.
And his mom's reaction is just so funny, so relatable.
Like she wasn't even that mad, you know?
Right, and then there's Friday Fun with his cousins on the roof of their building.
Such a classic childhood scene.
It is, and it speaks to this feeling of community that, extends beyond the immediate family.
I was going to say that sense of community is crucial context.
For sure.
Because when a society falls apart, which is what happened in Syria,
Yeah.
that web of connections just shreds, leaving people so vulnerable.
It's heartbreaking.
And then you see these tiny acts of love and care.
Like the Royal Cup story he tells.
Oh, yeah, where his mom always brought him water.
So sweet. It seems small, but it really emphasizes how deep that attachment was.
Right. And how consistent affection can build a child's sense of safety.
Then there are these heavier memories he shares, like about his mom's silent pain.
Where he remembers her discomfort, but she kind of brushed it off.
Exactly, and later he realizes she was fighting cancer.
Wow.
Even as a little kid, he sensed something was wrong.
Kids are more perceptive than we give them credit for, especially to unspoken stuff.
You're right. It's like this early awareness of her suffering prepared him for what was coming.
In a way, yeah, because it foreshadows this huge loss that's about to hit him.
And that's exactly what happens with the day my world shattered, his mom's death when he was only 6.
Oh, it's rough.
It's brutal the way he describes it. The phone call, his aunt's reaction, his immediate understanding of what happened.
You can just feel the impact.
It's gut-wrenching. He talks about how the woman whose laughter filled their house is suddenly just a memory.
Losing a parent that young, you can't overstate how much that affects a child.
No, absolutely not. Their development, their ability to cope with tough stuff later.
Everything.
And then he goes on to describe these last moments with her. In the back of a pickup truck, his dad urging him and his brother to say goodbye.
I remember this.
His brother Daya manages to, but Adam can't. He's too shy, too overcome by grief.
That must stay with you.
I think it definitely does, that inability to say goodbye.
Yeah, like unfinished business. Always wondering what if.
Totally. And, after his mom's death, his whole world changes.
It had to.
He talks about how childhood innocence just vanished, everything felt dull.
Right, like the life had been sucked out of everything.
Exactly, and then they moved to his mom's birthplace, Dara, for the burial.
Dara, that's significant later on, too.
We'll get to that, but he describes this big pit being dug and a smaller one inside it for his mom. It's such a powerful image of finality, seen through a child's eyes.
It really drives home the permanence of death.
It does, and so they stay with his mom's relatives after the burial.
Okay.
He talks about these distant cousins, all sisters, just surrounding him.
Oh, I bet they were curious.
They were. They kept asking him to tell them what happened.
He's this little kid, suddenly the focus of all this attention.
Right. For a tragedy, he's barely begun to process himself.
That's a lot to handle.
It is, but, he remembers the village as this warm haven.
In a way, it was an escape from the immediate grief.
Yeah, his relatives were kind, patient, never really scolded him for being a kid.
That's so important, that sense of stability.
It is, and he talks about this springtime bliss in the village too. fields of flowers, this feeling of freedom.
It's interesting how he contrasts that with what Dara becomes later.
You're right, it's like this peaceful image is forever tainted by the conflict that comes.
A real before and after.
Now, as he gets older, he starts to reflect on those early family dynamics after his mom died.
Which were, not easy from what he describes.
Not at all. He mentions finding solace amidst tension whenever his stepmom traveled.
Okay, so it was a relief when she wasn't around.
It seems that way, and it points to these complexities that can come up in blended families.
Especially after a loss, everyone's grieving differently.
Absolutely. And he describes his dad as a father absorbed in work, often preoccupied.
So maybe not the most emotionally available during this time.
No, Adam remembers trying to talk to him about his stepmom's behavior, but his dad's attention was always elsewhere.
That must have been frustrating.
It was, and it speaks to this breakdown in communication, in support.
Right, at a time when they all needed it most.
Exactly, and he talks about the long-term effects of family conflict.
So it wasn't just a phase, it had lasting impact.
No, these daily struggles, his stepmom's unpredictable moods, it created this tension that was constant.
A very unsettling environment.
It was. He felt adrift, even though his dad sometimes tried to step in.
But it wasn't enough.
It wasn't, and this went on until he was around 15.
That's a long time.
It is, and he says that's when he found the strength to stand up to his stepmom.
So he developed resilience as a way to cope.
It seems like it, a move towards independence, self-assertion.
But it doesn't erase the emotional scars.
No, not at all. And, alongside these difficult family dynamics, he also had these really important childhood bonds.
Like with his cousin Amar, right?
Yes, Amar was technically his uncle, but only 3 months older.
Okay, I remember that.
They were in the same class for years, always getting the top marks.
Competitive, but in a good way.
I think so. He even tells the story about feeling a twinge of envy when Amar got gifts from their teacher for getting first place.
I can relate to that.
Right, but then Amar does this really heartfelt gesture.
What did he do?
He immediately shared the gifts with Adam.
Oh, that's sweet.
It is. It shows the depth of their bond,
Totally. The friendly rivalry, but also the deep affection.
Absolutely. And then there's this inseparable trio, Dia, Amar, and their uncle's son, Salem.
Quite the crew.
He describes them crafting memories together through play, making toys out of anything they could find.
Resourceful, I like it.
They were, and he tells this hilarious story about their attempt to build a flying car.
A flying car?
Yeah, they learned about helium and thought they could make it work.
Oh boy, that must have been a sight.
It was a total flop, but it's such a classic example of that childhood imagination.
And the fun of experimenting, even when it fails miserably.
Exactly. And he also talks about the magic of childhood fueled by shows like Digimon Adventure, Harry Potter, Yu-Gi-Oh!, Pokemon.
Those were huge back then.
They were. He describes how they'd make wizard wands, invent Pokemon games.
It's amazing how those shared cultural experiences shape kids' imaginations.
They do. It gives them a common language, a world to escape into.
Especially important when things are tough at home or in the world around them.
That's true. And, he even shares his first experience with young love.
Oh, tell me about it.
It was at his aunt's house under the stars.
Oh, romantic.
Right. And it was all very innocent and awkward.
First crushes are the best. So much fumbling around.
I know. And he tells this funny story about trying to give a girl Muhammad's sister's phone number.
What, like a mix-up?
Yeah, this whole elaborate plan that just ends up being clumsy.
Teenagers.
It's a great reminder that even with everything going on, those universal experiences still happen.
First love, social awkwardness. It's all part of growing up.
Absolutely. And he talks about this transformation from shy to shine in his teen years.
Oh, so he came out of his shell.
He did. By 10th and 11th grade, he was more outgoing, more popular.
It's interesting how he made that shift.
It is. It shows a real effort to push himself to connect with others.
Good for him.
Now, this relatively normal backdrop starts to change dramatically when we get to the origins of conflict.
Here we go.
He mentions that the unrest actually started in Dara, his hometown.
Oh, wow. So he was right there at the center of it.
He was, and his ID card showed his Dara origin.
Okay, how did that play in?
It led to more scrutiny at checkpoints, those government roadblocks.
So just having Dara on your ID became suspicious.
It did, and it made travel way more difficult and dangerous as things escalated.
Makes sense. Your identity suddenly becomes a liability.
It did, and he pinpoints the spark of the unrest to March 2011.
What happened?
Teenagers were arrested for anti-government graffiti.
And the government cracked down hard.
They did, brutally, which fueled these huge protests demanding their release, demanding freedom.
But instead of backing down, the government doubled down.
Exactly, turning what was local unrest into a national uprising.
And it spread fast.
Like wildfire, even to places that had been relatively safe, like Damascus.
So that government response was a major turning point.
It was a catalyst for much wider discontent and ultimately violence.
Makes you think about how those in power react to dissent, right?
It does, and Adam describes his own reaction to this escalating violence.
Okay, how did he feel?
It was this heat of despair, amplified by the literal heat, the summer heat.
Oh man, I bet that was oppressive.
It was, and there were constant power outages.
Adding to the misery.
Totally. He even describes seeing his little sister having to sit in a bucket of water just to cool down.
That's rough.
It is, and he talks about this anger he felt towards the Shabiya.
The regime's enforcers, right?
Yeah, the ones responsible for the brutal crackdowns.
So in that moment of anger and frustration, he makes a decision.
He does this impulsive, uncertain journey to try and find the Free Army.
One of the main opposition groups.
Right, the image of his sister in the bucket, it really hits you.
It shows how the conflict was impacting everyone, even kids.
Absolutely. And his anger, his desire to do something, it's understandable.
Yeah, you feel for him in that moment.
He describes walking to the main road, waiting for a bus, not even sure how he'd find the Free Army.
So it was more of an impulse than a plan.
It seems that way, and when he gets to the town he was heading for, he describes these desolate streets.
Eerie, like a ghost town.
It was this strange silence, and then he encounters army units under the bridge.
Wow, that must have been scary.
It was this intimidating military presence.
A reminder of who really held the power.
Right, and just as fear starts to grip him, his sister calls.
Let's talk about timing.
It was a lifeline in crisis. He tells her he'll be back soon.
So he changed his mind.
He does. Right then and there, he decides to go back home.
It's interesting how that connection with his sister pulled him back.
I know, it shows how strong family ties can be, even amidst chaos.
Absolutely. And he spends a little time in Old Damascus before actually going home.
Like he needed a moment to gather himself.
To process what just happened.
Yeah, and to prepare for the inevitable confrontation with his family.
He must have been worried sick.
They were, but later that day, he sees news of a suicide car bombing in Damascus.
Oh no, who was behind it?
Jabhat al-Nusra, a militant Islamist group.
That's a whole other level of scary.
It was a huge turning point, these echoes of chaos.
Signaling the rise of more radical groups.
Right, and he notes how, in the weeks that follow, the sounds of war just become normal.
Like shelling, gunfire.
Exactly. He calls it from shock to routine.
It's unsettling how people adapt to constant violence.
It is. It becomes part of daily life.
A tragic reality.
It is, and amidst all this escalating chaos, his family is hit with another tragedy.
What happened?
His grandfather, Amar's father, suffers a stroke, leaving him partially paralyzed.
Oh no, on top of everything else.
I know, it adds this whole other layer of difficulty to their lives.
Caring for someone with those needs in a war zone.
It's unimaginable, and to support the family, Adam and Amar get summer jobs at a bread factory.
Talk about contrast. Bread and bullets.
Right, and one morning on their way to work, they notice something strange.
What was it?
An empty street, which was really unusual in a city that's normally bustling.
An ominous sign.
It was, and then they get stopped at a checkpoint by the Shabiya.
Oh, that's terrifying.
It was, and they were carrying a decent amount of money, which made them even more scared.
Because it could be misinterpreted.
Exactly, they were terrified of being accused of something.
It really shows how arbitrary and dangerous these encounters were.
It does, just being in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Okay, so this brings us to part 2. Displacement and radicalization.
Right, so as the conflict shifts, parts of Dara ironically become safer than Damascus.
How does that happen?
The front lines move, it's constantly changing.
So they relocate again.
They do. Adam, Daya, and Amar finding a new refuge.
Where do they end up?
Jasem, a village, but it's a huge change from Damascus.
From city lights to village shadows.
Exactly, and he really misses the familiar faces, the energy of the city.
That sense of loss, of displacement, it's a common theme.
It is, and despite this, he feels this silent resolve to go back to Damascus alone.
Without telling his family.
He only tells Amar.
Wow, what was he thinking?
It's not totally clear, but he takes this tense bus journey, constantly worried about soldiers searching phones.
That was standard practice, right?
It was, to monitor for dissent.
Makes you think about how little privacy people had.
Right, and he was terrified of being caught with any anti-regime stuff.
Understandably.
Totally. And he makes it back to Damascus, but it's a home lost to silence.
With no neighbors, frequent power outages.
It just adds to the sense of isolation.
I can't imagine how lonely that must have felt.
He stays with his cousin Muhammad for a bit before going back to Juzam,
Okay.
but he really struggles to focus on his studies during his final year of school.
A year like no other.
It was the turmoil, the displacement, it all made it impossible to concentrate.
And then the conflict escalates in Jizim too.
It does. Jabhat al-Nusra arrives. There's more regime bombing.
So they're essentially escaping one war zone for another.
That's it. And it really shows how relentless the conflict was.
No safe haven anywhere.
Exactly. But amidst all this, he describes this strange sense of dark humor.
What do you mean?
He talks about watching shell landings with Daya and Amar.
Like it was a spectacle.
In a way. And they even played a prank on their family.
That's wild, finding humor in the midst of danger.
It seems crazy, but it's a coping mechanism.
It has to be. A way to deflect from the constant fear.
And then his sister makes the tough decision to leave for the Arabian Gulf.
Another separation.
It is another piece of their family scattered by the conflict.
It's heartbreaking how many families were torn apart.
It is, and then comes this checkpoint crisis.
What happened?
Amar gets temporarily imprisoned at a routine check.
For what?
It's not clear. It seems totally arbitrary.
It emphasizes how vulnerable everyone was.
Absolutely. And after that, the family decides to relocate again to a free army-controlled area of Damascus.
Hoping for more safety.
Right. And his aunt decides to leave for Malaysia.
Adding to the sense of family scattered.
Exactly. They eventually end up in a new town near Muhammad.
A glimmer of hope for a fresh start.
Maybe, but it's still incredibly fragile.
And despite all this, Adam stays focused on his studies.
He does, studying through strife.
That takes serious dedication.
It does, and he manages to get a decent score on his final exams.
Good for him.
He and Amar then get jobs at a lollipop factory to support their family.
New roles, new challenges.
They are, and they have another scary run-in at a government checkpoint.
It feels like these were just unavoidable.
They were a constant threat, and then they experience this casual day turned nightmare.
Oh no, what happened?
A nearby explosion rocks their neighborhood.
And they have to evacuate his grandfather.
They do, which is incredibly difficult given his condition.
I can only imagine.
It's chaotic, and after that, he and Amar apply to university.
Paths to higher education.
Yeah, but he doesn't get into his first choice, English literature.
That's disappointing.
It was, but he does get accepted into a computer institute.
So there's still a chance.
There is, but then plans change drastically.
What happens?
He decides to go to Malaysia to work for his aunt's husband's brother.
Okay, Anna Moore.
Amar stays behind.
Another difficult separation.
It was, and he has these bittersweet goodbyes with everyone.
You can feel the uncertainty of the future.
Absolutely, and there's this really poignant moment with his dad before he leaves.
Unspoken goodbye.
That's it, heavy with unspoken emotions. And since the Damascus airport is closed for civilian flights, he has to go through Lebanon.
Damascus to Beirut.
Right, a whole other journey.
And then from Beirut to Malaysia.
It was a long haul, and there's this funny moment with unexpected baggage.
What happened?
They were carrying kishka, you know, that traditional Syrian food?
Yeah, I love kishka.
Well, it caused some confusion with airport security because of how it looks.
They probably didn't know what to make of it.
Exactly, and when they get to Malaysia, it's this whole other experience.
Emerging into Malaysia.
It felt like a sanctuary after all they'd been through.
A breath of fresh air.
It was, and they arrive at the restaurant where they'll be working.
Okay.
And he's struck by this table of emotions.
What did he mean?
This stark contrast between their war-torn past and this peaceful present.
It must have been overwhelming.
It was a lot to process, but they get some rest and then have their introduction to the UNHCR.
The UN Refugee Agency.
Right, the first step in seeking asylum.
A long process.
It is, and they start work almost immediately at the restaurant.
Work begins.
Long hours, tough conditions.
It sounds like it.
It was, and they don't really explore much outside of work.
Too busy, too much culture shock.
That's it, but, you know, the arrival in Malaysia does offer this immediate sense of safety.
That's huge, that feeling of security.
It is, but there are still challenges, like those airport procedures, the intense emotions.
It highlights how disorienting displacement can be.
Totally, and then they're thrown into this demanding work.
The pressure to rebuild their lives.
It's a lot to handle, and soon after they arrive, his aunt leaves for Saudi Arabia.
Another separation.
It is, separation in a strange land.
Leaving them feeling even more alone.
And the restaurant job quickly turns sour.
What happened?
The atmosphere becomes work hard, rest never.
That's brutal.
It was, and Abu Fairs, their employer, changes.
Not in a good way.
No, he becomes much less sympathetic.
So they decide to leave.
They do. It's this desperate escape with his friend Obey
Where do they go?
to find factory work.
Hoping for better conditions.
That's the idea, but it ends up being endless work days at the factory.
With little pay.
Yeah, and they get more and more frustrated with how they're being treated.
It's like they can't catch a break.
It's tough, but eventually they save up enough to get their own room in a condominium.
A new beginning.
It is a small step towards independence.
It's amazing how resilient they are through all of this.
It is, and this brings us to part 3, de-radicalization and asylum in Sweden.
Okay, so how does that all unfold?
Well, after leaving the factory, Adam really embraces this feeling of freedom.
Embracing freedom.
That's it, and he goes through a bunch of different jobs.
A roller coaster of jobs.
Exactly, including this really grueling cleaning gig.
That sounds rough.
It was, and another restaurant job that ends with him getting fired.
Oh, no.
But he actually sees it as a good thing.
When job loss became a blessing in disguise.
That's it. It freed him from another bad situation.
Interesting perspective.
It is. And then he takes this rejuvenating trip to Cameron Highlands with friends.
Among the clouds.
That's the one. And it's a much-needed break from all the hardship.
Sounds like it.
It was, and this trip leads to him forming these really close friendships.
Unbreakable friendship.
Exactly. It gives him this crucial sense of belonging, of support.
That's so important, especially after everything he's been through.
Totally. And he goes through this phase of new paths and awkward encounters.
Tell me about it.
He works at Khaled's restaurant. There's this embarrassing incident with a colleague's sister.
Oh, boy.
It's all part of life in transition. He's dating Sabrina, deepening his friendships.
Oh, he's building a life in Malaysia?
He is. He moves to Damansara to work for Khaled, gets a more comfortable apartment.
Still life in transition, though.
It is, but he finds this real camaraderie with the staff at the restaurant.
A melting pot of friendship.
Exactly. They come from all different backgrounds.
That's cool.
It is, and they get caught up in the excitement of the FIFA World Cup.
Even with the extra work it brings.
Right, they make it work, and he takes another trip to Cameron Highlands.
Sounds like he really loved it there.
He did, and it sparks this dream of maybe moving to Langkawi.
From highlands to islands.
It's this hopeful vision of the future.
You can feel his optimism.
Definitely, and then there's this seemingly small event that has big consequences.
What is it?
A free eye checkup.
Okay.
It leads to him being tempted to buy glasses.
From clear vision to clouded plans.
That's it. It's like this foreshadowing of the uncertainty that's coming.
Interesting.
It is. And he moves into a cheaper apartment with new friends.
Okay.
And there's this funny encounter in the hallway.
From hallways to home.
Right, but then things take a darker turn.
What happens?
He starts using drugs with these new acquaintances, O'Day, Salem, and Ali.
Oh, no.
It's a dangerous shift in his journey.
It is. It suggests a vulnerability to negative influences.
You're right, and he goes into detail about their experiences.
It highlights how easy it is to get caught up in that world.
Especially when you're looking for acceptance, for belonging.
A slippery slope.
It is, and this leads to a close call with drug police.
Civil police encounter.
That's it, a tense moment.
And then there's conflict with Hashim over weed.
Yeah, which makes him quit his job at the supermarket.
The clash with Hashim.
It's a low point. But then after Ramadan in 2015, something changes.
What happens?
He experiences this powerful rediscovering spiritual connection.
Okay, how does that manifest?
He goes through this period of happiest days ever.
A complete turnaround.
It is, he finds faith, makes positive changes that people around him notice.
That's a really powerful testament to the impact of faith.
It is. And then this seemingly chance event happens.
Tell me about it.
He calls it prayer answered.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
He connects with a woman named Elma through selling Bakar's oven.
Bakar's oven?
Yeah, it's kind of random, but it leads to this opportunity to teach Arabic.
Wow, talk about unexpected.
He is welcomed into Elma's family.
Or welcome.
Exactly, and he starts teaching right away.
It sounds like things are falling into place.
They are, and he acknowledges this feeling of dependence on divine help.
Like things are happening for a reason.
It's that feeling, and he talks about Elma's kindness.
Unexpected kindness.
She offers him and his brother a place to stay, provides financial support.
That's incredible generosity.
It is. She even sends money to their family back in Syria.
Wow, going above and beyond.
Totally. And then comes the news that changes everything.
What is it?
His asylum application in Sweden is accepted.
Prayer answered indeed.
It is a life-altering moment.
I bet.
He emphasizes how important it was to be honest during his UNHCR interviews.
Like that was key to the positive outcome.
It seems that way, and Elma's support, it's really remarkable.
It is. She comes in at a crucial point, offering stability when he needed it most.
Absolutely, and the news about Sweden, it's this tangible hope for a safe future.
You can feel the weight lift off his shoulders.
So he embarks on this journey to Sweden.
What's it like?
He describes a really warm welcome upon arrival in Ängelholm.
That's great to hear.
It is, and he and his brother start settling into their new apartments.
So lending in.
They get help from the common, the local municipality.
That support is crucial.
It is, and he
Right.
talks about adapting to the Swedish winter.
That must have been a shock.
It was, and he encounters all sorts of cultural surprises.
A whole new world.
It is, but he has a positive experience at SFI, the language program.
And he learned Swedish quickly.
He does, probably because he already knew English.
That helps.
It does, but this promising new start takes a dark turn.
Oh no, what happens?
He encounters extremist interpretations of Islam online.
That's a dangerous path.
It is. He talks about the risks of selective interpretation.
It's easy to fall into echo chambers online.
You're right, and it leads to these naive beliefs.
He was vulnerable to that kind of messaging.
He was, and tragically, it culminates in him planning this staged act.
What kind of act?
Something to draw attention to what he saw as injustices.
A protest of some sort.
It seems that way. He calls it a compromise of conscience.
But it backfires.
It does. It